All right, and now we turn to Freud. Going to be a lot of fun. We are first going to go over his background and then talk about the characteristics of his approach and the evaluation, just like we did with Piaget. So, Freud was born in 1856. He was the eldest of eight children, born to a wool merchant and his wife. And he moved to Vienna at age 4, where he lived for most of the rest of his life. He was a big fan of himself and expected big things. He said, quote, "A man who has been the indisputable favorite of his mother keeps for life the feeling of a conqueror, that confidence of success that often induces real success." End quote. Keep in mind the mother comment. He was a voracious reader. He and a friend taught themselves Spanish so they could read Don Quixote in its original language. He also took up an interest in science. He entered medical school thinking he'd be a researcher for his whole life. And interestingly, his first research project was actually on the reproductive system of eels. We already could be a little Freudian on Freud. He left research when he faced problems due to being relatively poor, but also Jewish. This was a time when that was not good, obviously before the Holocaust, but it was still a lot of discrimination at the time. This led him to private practice, where as a medical doctor he treated nervous disorders. And this was very early in medical science. And so typically, physicians could do very little for their clients. They would often do hydrotherapy or electrotherapy. Those were two of the big forms of treatment. And he was fascinated with what he called hysteria, or what was called, not just he called it, but what was generally called hysteria. And this is paralysis, numbness, squinting, tremors, basically any physical problems that didn't have a known origin, a real reason for why they happened. And he found hypnosis of interest, and he contacted leaders in the field of hypnosis. And in particular, he was interested in one man who could produce the symptoms of hysteria in people through hypnotic suggestion alone. And this he took as evidence that hysteria was partially psychological in its basis. When Freud used it on his patients, he also found that they could recall incidents and feelings that were otherwise inaccessible to them. He also was interested in findings that the symptoms of hysteria could be alleviated by simply having his patients talk about their emotions from early in life. And he began talking about the, quote, talking cure, basically psychotherapy as we know it. His first book, The Interpretation of Dreams, was pretty unsuccessful, actually. It was largely ignored by the medical community and the general public. However, in 1909, Freud visited the United States, and he was much better received here. He ended up in the cover of Time magazine in 1924 and was a general hit. And this was especially after World War I. He got recognition, including in areas like literature, art, and education. The terms subconscious and ego became household terms. Id, as well, as one that even today we still hear commonly used outside of its Freudian origins. And while much of his work and he was famous, he also had largely a negative reaction people had to him. His notions of childhood sexuality, in particular, were negatively viewed and really shocked people, especially people in the United States. He continued his work. He even made changes in his views into his 70s. And he was forced to leave Vienna when the Nazis took over in 1937. He ended up dying in London in 1939, which is why I said he spent most of the rest of his life in Vienna. While Piaget is indisputably the most influential developmental psychologist. Freud is the most influential psychologist, and some regard him in terms of influence on par with Marx and Darwin. And as we will see, much of his work is discredited, but his beliefs, such as weaning and toilet training being easier, are actually still alive today. Also, his ideas about gender roles, we'll see how those come up. So, what is his approach all about? Well, he's got several of them, but the first one we're going to talk about is his dynamic approach. Basically, what he said is that there is nervous energy. We call it psychic energy or drive energy, libido, tension. All of these terms are similar. And in analogy to energy in physics, Freud said that nervous energy builds up and it's distributed. It's tied to mental images, it's transformed, and it's discharged. We have this mental energy that occurs, this psychological, physiological energy. And he said that psychological energy isn't destroyed, but instead it's transferred into anxiety. Now, there are two competing principles in life according to Freud, the pleasure principle and the reality principle. And we're going to see these pop up in the next couple slides as well, but they're good to talk about here first. The pleasure principle is that whenever possible, energy should be discharged without delay. And we want immediate, direct reduction of this tension. And this tension, when it's released, maximizes satisfaction if we do it in a way that we desire. So if we're hungry, we eat. If an infant needs to suck, they go after their thumb. And the way that it is best discharged, the way that this energy is best used, is when it is going after whatever you really want. Now this pleasure principle competes with the reality principle. And that principle says that small amounts of energy are discharged, but only when there is an indirect route. So you will have times where you can't do exactly what you want, and your instincts are restrained so that you can be integrated into society or at times even kept safe. Sometimes, if you do things that you want to do, you might end up not being in a very good position from a safety perspective. The desires in one's life that you want to feel, you want to discharge the energy towards, are based upon the stage of life that you are in. And we're going to get to his stages shortly. There are also two main instincts, as you can see on the slide, eros and general destructive instincts. Eros is sex, it's self-preservation, love, striving towards unity, and the destructive impulses are aggression, death instincts, hatred, things like that. Much of his theory is based on sex, and his interest in aggression really only came up following World War I. And in particular, the oral, anal, and genital areas, and we'll see the stages, are where he said that sexual instincts are played out, and that makes sense. And so, psychic energy then is derived from biological energy, in that the mind and body have this dynamic back and forth, this interplay, that we have the biological needs that get kind of transformed into psychological needs. And there's this nervous energy that comes about from it. So the aim of the sex drive and instinct is to remove bodily need, discharge tension, and experience pleasure. This all sounds kind of fancy, a lot of terminology, but basically what is happening is we have biological desires. We know we can't always act on them, so they get discharged in the best way possible, and we have these aggressive and sexual impulses that are pushing it. Okay, so is the dynamic approach, then there's also this structural approach. So we've said that there's this hydraulic system where there's urges with the body and the mind. And how are these acted out? What is actually going through these processes? Well, there are three structures. And you could think of these structures kind of similar to structuralism that we talked about last time in Piaget's background. So the three structures are the id, the ego, and the superego, as you can see on the slide. The id, the bottom part down here, is the most raw, unorganized, inborn part of personality that is present at birth. And it is where all biologically based drives come from. Hunger, sex, aggression, these things are all from the id. They're kind of our most animalistic biological instincts. And the goal of the id is to maximize satisfaction in accordance to the pleasure principle. We want what we want when we want it. The energy that is in the id, the energy of the id, is invested in action that would satisfy the instinct in a way, or in the indirect ways that we said before, where we would get partial satisfaction. So an infant might satisfy oral needs through either a nipple or through imagining a bottle. Freud said that young infants really only have an id, kind of like how Piaget said that early on you just have reflexes. Well, reflexes to Piaget it's kind of like the id to Freud. And he developed this theory through his study of dreams. And he said that the desires of the id would appear in dreams in many, many ways. So the id is the animalistic instinct that we have. The ego is the second part of personality. And it is the rational and reasonable part of personality. This first develops when infants learn that just because they think about something, they want something, that doesn't make it happen. So when they're hungry, just thinking about being hungry or being satisfied doesn't make that biological need go away. And the inability for them to immediately get the desired outcome leads to the development of the ego. And this is the mechanism for adapting to reality. It's kind of the buffer between the real world and the id. So the id is desire, it wants, whereas the ego has logic, perception, problem solving, these types of things. And the ego functions under the reality principle. And that is where your instincts are restrained in order to maintain safety, integration into society, and the like that we talked about on the last slide. Importantly here, when the ego is overwhelmed, one of 5 defense mechanisms were used, according to Freud. Those are repression, reaction formation, projection, regression, and fixation. Those are the 5, according to Freud. So the reality principle basically says that if your id says, I want to eat an entire chocolate cake, you can't do that in front of people or else you're going to think you're weird. So you've got to help, there's got to be some buffer there. Now, the last to develop is the superego. The superego is a person's conscience. It's their ability to distinguish right and wrong. And it develops age 5 or 7, or 5 to 7, and it is learned from parents and teachers, other people in positions of authority. And this comes about when children resolve their Oedipus complex, which we will get to. And Oedipus, by the way, is Oedipus. It's spelled oddly. On tests and stuff, I don't care about spelling as long as I know what you're talking about. So don't worry too much about it. But nonetheless. So they resolve their Oedipus complex and they begin to identify with their parents. And there are two parts to this. It's the conscious and the ego ideal. And the conscious is negative, where the ego ideal is positive. So the conscious basically tells you what you can't do. It is comprised of prohibitions, which lead to feelings of guilt. Whereas the ego ideal is the kind of standards of conduct you try to live up to. So the conscious is what you're not supposed to do, and the ego ideal is what you should be. And feelings of self-esteem and pride come up when the ego ideal is met. The superego is in conflict with the id and the ego. And the superego is basically society's way of maintaining order. Now, so we have our structural approach. Now we're getting to the topographic approach, which might at first seem kind of odd, but let's just see if we can get into it a little bit further. I hope it will make sense shortly. Anyway, so he said that there are three parts of consciousness: the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious. The unconscious is thoughts and feelings that are repressed and therefore unknown. And this material that is in it can't get into the consciousness unless there's some kind of intervention, where there's weakening of either ego defenses or if there's a therapist around to help out. And we can see this in this picture here, where the deepest part, this dark purple, this is information that is unconscious. Then this is preconscious, and the area that is out of the water is our conscious. So the preconscious, this middle part, is capable of becoming conscious because it's not actively barred from becoming conscious. It is also closer to our conscious than our unconscious. Things can slip in and out of our conscious. And things in our preconscious become conscious when we have some kind of link to language, when we form mental images about things, remember things, and the like. And finally, the conscious, all the information up here, is basically synonymous with what a person is aware of at the moment. It's what you are thinking of, what you are aware of. That's what is up here. So we can see that in this iceberg analogy, the information that's up here in this part of ice is not always there. Sometimes it'll swap down there and back up. So instead of an iceberg, maybe if it's a gel berg, that the information, the part that is in the conscious, is changing fairly quickly. And because energy is required for a thought to hop up into the consciousness, only a few thoughts can be conscious at any one time. And just to reiterate it again, it does definitely fit with the id, ego, and superego. So all of the id is unconscious. All of it is the deep underwater level. The ego and the superego are in all three of the levels. Yeah. Now, one of the things that makes Freud's theory somewhat developmental is that developmental changes occur in the relative sizes of our three levels of consciousness, preconscious, and unconscious. Freud said that an infant's mind is almost all unconscious. And that makes sense, right? Because he said that it's basically all id. So if it's all id, well, that's all unconscious. But as age increases, the preconscious and the conscious take up more and more over time. But while it's taking up more and more over time, the unconscious is always the largest part, even in adults. This part down here is always going to be the biggest. Of particular note for us is the unconscious, because the unconscious has the most important role, and it is where most of the time that Freud would spend with clients would be trying to help them understand their unconscious, the id. And it would come up in psychoanalytic sessions with patients, and they would have sexual fantasies or impulses that they were unaware of, but led them to some kind of inexplicable behavior, or at least so he said. And evidence for the unconscious and the id came from hypnosis, slips of the tongue, which we now call Freudian slips, and dreams. So let's get to that a little bit more. How did he come up with this? Well, the first thing and the biggest red flag for a developmental psychologist is that he did not study children. And while this is odd, there was at least some rationale, which we can take or leave. I would leave it, but we can talk about it. And the rationale was that he said that childhood always remained with us, always, and that our adult personalities are actually the kind of residual of our childhoods. Now, it's also awfully convenient that his patients were all adults, but So the idea is that childhood stays with us throughout life. It is not like Piaget. Remember Piaget, there were qualitative differences in thought from as you got older. So you couldn't think like a child. You couldn't remember things from your childhood in the way that at least Freud says that you could. Now he also did Freud, that is, did a self-analysis from 1897 through the rest of his life. He actually reserved the last half hour of each day for it. And this made him even more sure of his theory. But it might actually make me even less sure of his theory. Now, another reason I will cynically say that he didn't study children is that the methods that he used with adults, the ones that he liked and he was really aware of, you can't use in children. So let's talk about those now. So the first one is free association. And this is where patients just verbally report what is in their stream of thought. Generally speaking, patients would just relax on a couch in a quiet room, and Freud would sit near them but out of sight, as you guys probably have an idea of. That's kind of the stereotypical thought of what therapy is, even though it's not really that way anymore today, unless you go to someone who is psychoanalytic. Freud would instruct people to report their every thought, regardless of how trivial it seemed. And what he said is this promoted the ego's relaxation of control over the unconscious. And in that way, repressed thoughts could emerge. Information from the unconscious could kind of pop up a little bit, at least. And the rationale behind this also included the fact that he thought that because every psychological event has meaning, every thought or feeling, because they're caused by something, right? They're not randomly occurring. There has to be something there. So if one thought leads to another, there could be something that is connected. So if someone talks about a deceased father and then abruptly changes the subject to a trip they're thinking of taking, Freud might say that these people could be troubled by their father's death. Okay, so free association. Next up, dream analysis. So if all thoughts are important, like we said with free association, then you can't ignore dreams, at least to Freud. Freud thought that even more unconscious material came to the fore through dream analysis. And when people were asleep than when they were awake. Because he thought that during dreams, your psychological controls are sleeping. And this allows the unconscious to be shown. So you can have disturbing thoughts expressed, wishes fulfilled in ways that you can't, and might even be ashamed to have happen if you said that you were thinking about it. And even with you and I, we'll tell people about dreams we had that are bizarre, that if we said, hey, I'm thinking about this thing, they might think we're crazy. So, as you guys might remember from Intro Psych, he also said that dreams have two different types of meaning to them. There's a manifest meaning and the latent content. And the latent content is the hidden meaning, and only psychoanalysts can know what that is. Manifest meaning, on the other hand, is what is actually there, what you're actually dreaming about. So if you're dreaming about a fire hydrant and a robot walking by it, the manifest information is that there is a fire hydrant and a robot is walking by it. The latent meaning to it is whatever the meaning to it is. Now, I just made that off the top of my head. I don't think there's any meaning to dream analysis anyway, but you get the point, I hope. Now, with dream analysis, only trained psychoanalysts to Freud could truly detect what the meanings are, which is convenient. And then the last one is transference. And the transference is basically the notion that during therapy, a client would transfer their thoughts and feelings onto the therapist. They would quite literally fall in love with or hate the therapist. And this was critical to Freud. It allows a client to act out or relive whatever the experiences are, the relevant experiences there are for the client with no repercussions. And that it helps analysts discover the true nature of of a patient's relationships, especially with their childhood relationships with their parents. That you could act out towards a client, or towards a therapist, the way you would like to with parents, even if your parents were dead. You could act towards Freud or another analyst in that way. So together, what if we take everything together, what do we say that Freud did? Well, he listened to troubled adults talk about their childhood and their current experiences. He did not do experiments. He did not observe children. He didn't observe them in their natural surroundings or in the lab. However, he did, to his credit, spend hundreds of hours with some clients, though. Not necessarily all of them, but some of them. All right, so now that we have an idea of the methodology, let's talk about his stage approach. So, just like how we first talked about Piaget's stage approach and then we got into the details of it, we're going to do that here. So Freud's stage approach makes two main claims about human development. And the first is that the first years in life are the most important ones. And the second one is that development occurs through psychosexual stages. So while the idea that childhood can have a huge impact on later life now to us seems obvious, it really wasn't then. Just like I said with Piaget, and remember Freud's substantially before Piaget, people didn't really think about what children thought or felt, really. They didn't really care that much. But Freud thought that was true, though. But he even went further, saying that both normal and abnormal development had their roots in the early years of life. His stages changed based on what pleases or gratifies specific parts of the body. So if children are unable to gratify themselves sufficiently during a stage, or if they have too much gratification, they could become fixated. And additionally, how children relate to other people and how they feel about themselves is based on these stages. Now, how do we change from one to another? How do they change from one stage to another? Well, it's biologically determined. Therefore, you move on from one stage to the next no matter what, even if there is unfinished business in the past stage. And remember, this is different than Piaget. He said you had to master information in one stage in order to move on to the next. An additional thing to note here about Freud's stage approach versus Piaget's is that we can see the remnants of earlier stages in Freud in much more meaningful ways than with Piaget. Okay, so now on to the stages. And again, we're just going to do a brief overview and then get into each stage specifically. So the oral stage is birth to a year, and this is where they receive gratification based on sucking, eating, mouthing, biting, etc. All kids, as we talked about with Piaget, you give them something when they're 6 months old, they try to put it in their mouth. The anal stage is from 1 to 3 years, and this is where the gratification comes from either expelling or withholding feces and coming to terms with society's controls in relation to toilet training. So really it's all about toilet training here. The phallic stage is 3 to 5 or 6 years. This is where there is interest in genitals. We also are trying to come to terms with the Oedipus complex. And this is where the identification with a same-sex parent comes from. So this will be key when we talk about gender identification, gender roles. Next is the latency period. This is 5 to 6 years to adolescence. There's really not a whole lot going on here. And we can see how Piaget might have been in some ways influenced by Freud in that this time is kind of the concrete operational stage. We're kind of working things out, 7 to 11 for Piaget, working out issues. And then finally, the genital stage from adolescence to adulthood. This is the reemergence of sexual interests and the establishment of mature sexual relationships. So first up, the oral stage. So again, what do infants do when you give them something? They put it in their mouths. And he said that there is both pleasure and pain from this. The pleasure comes from fulfilling desires, so sucking, chewing, eating, biting, etc. And there is sexual gratification, sexual satisfaction by relieving the uncomfortable sexual excitations that occur. This causes pleasant feelings in the lips, tongue, mouth, etc. And this is why you do it, because it feels good to you. Now, Freud calling it sexual, though, is part of where he ran into some problems with some people. This is also why when people do this, infants do this, it doesn't have to be linked to hunger, because the activities themselves are enjoyable. You enjoy chewing on things, teething things, etc. Now the pain, I said there's pleasure and pain. The pain comes from frustration and anxiety when sexual tensions are not fulfilled. So either a preferred object might not be present when they want it, so a preferred object to suck on, a preferred pacifier, for example. And in that case, they've got to wait, which is frustrating, which causes anxiety. Remember, we have these desires, and they cause us to have this tension building up. And if we don't get what we want, there are problems from it. So they have to wait, and it's frustrating and anxiety arousing. Now, they might, when they can't have what they want, turn to a different object. So instead of a pacifier, they could go for their fingers, or a blanket, or a soft toy. But the satisfaction here is not complete. It's kind of like having chocolate ice cream when you want chocolate cake. It's just not quite hitting it as well as you might like for it to. It's partial satisfaction. Now, in this time, other frustration occurs from giving up nighttime feeds, from not being allowed to chew on certain objects because they are either unsanitary or you're just not supposed to. So if you get, I don't know, what could be an example? You find a tissue on the ground, an infant does. They'll probably try to put that in their mouth. Well, if they want to do that, and a parent rightfully says no, that causes frustration. And the time when frustration most comes about is when weaning occurs, when they are trying to go from breastfeeding to regular food. Now, there are problems here if they are either receiving too much or too little gratification. When there is too little gratification, there is frequent anxiety, and people will look to fulfill the needs years later. If there is too much if there's too much gratification, it can make it difficult to move to new stages and can cause fixation. Also to note here is the most important thing that occurs in this stage, and that is the attachment to mother. Freud said that mother's contributions are, quote, unique, without parallel, established unalterably for a whole lifetime as the first and strongest love object, and as the prototype of all later love relations, end quote. It seems to me to again be kind of Freudian on Freud, somebody might have some mama issues. Nonetheless, this is one of Freud's greatest legacies, the idea that attachment is super important. This is one of the cases, and Freud actually had many of these things, where he was kind of right about the importance of something, but the way he talked about it was kind of weird. And we're going to talk about attachment both in the evolution lecture, and then we're going to talk about attachment. We're having an entire day on, or entire lecture on attachment later in the semester. And attachment is a good thing to Freud. He said that it helps lead to a healthy sense of separateness from the mother. Freud also said that the correct type of mothering is where there is a synchrony between an infant's needs and the mother's behaviors. When this occurs, he said that infants he literally said they feel omnipotent because they can automatically get whatever desire they have. If moms can anticipate and deliver on what children will need, then they feel omnipotent because they think it and it happens, or they feel it and it happens. However, this inevitably is not going to happen, right? There's no way that mothers can always do this. And so this leads to a delay of gratification and a delay in dealing with what they want, and then more frustration. And this is the first time that the ego develops, as we talked about earlier, when it can't immediately occur. You can't get what you want. Mothers also provide the building block for later social relationships. Freud said because it's the first relationship a child has. And while you want a good relationship, if you go too far and children are too strongly attached, they can become overly dependent and anxious. So much of this is the Goldilocks principle, that you don't want too much, you don't want too little, you want the right amount. And this is true for all of his stages. Okay, so one of the things kind of self-quiz yourself on would be how many different ways in the oral stage alone do we see the influence of Freud in later life. We see attachment, which we're going to talk about later, as one of them. We see weaning, so many different things. Okay, moving on to the anal stage from 1 to 3 years old. At the end of the oral stage, there is the beginning of personality. And this is where they get attitudes about themselves, attitudes about other people. They start to learn mechanisms to achieve gratification. And they have now moved to their first conflict with the outside world, other than their mother. Remember how we talked about in Piaget, for kids, their world is their desires. Well, if mom is the one fulfilling those desires, largely through breastfeeding, and then as the first social attachment, well, they haven't really had to deal with the rest of the world. Now they do. And the big conflict is toilet training. He said that the need to defecate causes tension, which is resolved by defecating. This is not mind-blowing. However, because of this, the body is kind of programmed such that anal stimulation and the reduction of tension creates pleasure. However, society, in the form of parents and others, demands toilet training, and this causes further self-control. And so the desire for immediate gratification causes frustration, because you can't just poop wherever you want, right? I mean, kids have to learn this fairly early, that there are specific designated places we tell them to go. Now, how people navigate this stage depends on the age that toilet training occurs. It depends on how strict toilet training is. And it also depends on a mother's attitude towards defecation or cleanliness as well. So, if toilet training is done in a harsh way, the child can become anxious. And that anxiety can generalize elsewhere where authority makes demands. So they could end up defecating at inappropriate times or places. They could become obsessively neat, or they could become overly messy and dirty. And therefore, the goal of this stage is to allow enough, but not too much gratification, and the building of enough, but not too much self-control. And when this occurs, you'll have a more mature ego that's been developed, and they will be ready for the next stage. Now, in all stages following the first, regression can occur. And that's where anxiety in a later stage can cause you to go back to the activities in a past stage. So you can have a child who hasn't sucked their thumb for 6 months. And if they become frustrated with toilet training, they might start sucking on their thumbs again, or something like that, chewing on their thumb, whatever. So you can go back, just like if in the phallic stage, you could come back and have issues with toilet training and all the way through. Okay, good. So now let's move to that phallic stage, 3 to 5 to 6 years. This is the most controversial stage. It's the weirdest stage. So just know that any statements in this are not endorsements of it. Nobody agrees that this stuff occurs. But it, again, if you want to talk about why we have such strict gender roles, I really think we can trace it back, at least in part, to Freud and the pseudoscience-y appeal he made to identification with the same-sex parent. So it's called the phallic stage because the possession of the phallus in boys and its absence in girls. And Freud thought that this was a major concern for children. At this time, 3 to 5 to 6 years, pleasures and anxiety come from the genitals. Stimulation of them brings tension, and if tensions are relieved, pleasure. Why is it that in around this age, little boys have their hands down their pants all the time? You guys, if you've ever been around 4-year-olds, you know that this can occur a bizarre amount. So Freud emphasized male development more than female, and he thought that the phallic stage was particularly important for boys. And we'll see why here. The problem that we have is that in this stage, he said that sexual urges are directed towards your opposite sex parent. And in boys, this is called the Oedipus complex. In girls, it was later called the Electra complex. So the Oedipus complex is from Greek mythology, and this is where Oedipus kills his father and then marries his mother. And this is the sexual desire in males for their mothers. Literally, a sexual desire. Again, Freud's weird. So young boys want their mothers and don't want to share them with their fathers. However, boys are afraid they will be castrated by their father. And in this situation, boys then come to identify with their father. They see their mother likes things about their father, so be like father. They develop an emotional bond with their father. They strive to be like him. They internalize his beliefs, his values, interests, etc. And this is important, as I've said, because it is the basis for socialization and gender roles, according to Freud, and in my mind, the basis for the kind of pseudo-intellectualization of gender roles and rigid gender roles and stereotyping. Because for Freud, if you're a little boy who identifies more with your mother, then there is something wrong with you. If you're a girl and you identify more with dad and you take on his beliefs and values, there is something wrong to you. Again, according to Freud, not according to me, just to put it out there. So, in particular, the superego is developed here. These are societal values. And this is how, through identification with your same-sex parent, you come to adopt societal values. So, while the boys have their complex, it is intense. The girls' complex is less intense, and this is for a weird reason. Freud said that girls desire to be with their father, and they experience penis envy as she realizes that her father has a penis and she does not. And girls feel as though they have been castrated and then blame their mother. And because castration is not possible for girls anymore, girls then feel the threat from their mother is less than boys feel the threat from their father is, which supposedly leads to a weaker identification of girls with their mother than boys with their father, which I also believe fits into our societal kind of stereotype that if a girl takes on characteristics of a man, that is less pathological than if a man develops characteristics of a female. We think that that is, oh, hold on. Like there's a big problem when that occurs, at least in some ways societally. When this stage is successfully resolved, he said personality is basically set. It's going to change over time, but mainly through the differentiation of basic personality at this point. There are actually no big substantial changes to personality through the rest of life. You will see the next two stages have surprisingly little going on. And this is why Freud said that for adults, he wanted to get back to talking about their childhood because he thought that this was largely what mattered. If you had problems, psychological problems, they came about probably because of issues from the age of 6 or earlier. And the last thing to just restate, or put into words at least, is that the Oedipus complex and penis envy are probably the two most controversial parts of his any parts of his theory. Okay, moving on now. So the latency period is from 5 to 6 to puberty. In this period, there's not a whole lot going on. He said that sexual desires are repressed here, and there's no real new excitement that occurs. And he even said that children forget the sexual urges of earlier years. Now, they don't really forget it because childhood is with you forever, remember, according to him. But they're not at least conscious of it because they're repressing it. So instead, they're focused on acquiring cultural values, skills, schooling, stuff like that. And the ego and the superego are developing here primarily. And that's it. Nothing going on in latency. Then the final stage is the genital stage. And this is adolescence on. And sexual impulses that were repressed earlier now come back as a part of the physiological changes that occur in puberty. And instead of kind of childlike sexuality, they are now channeled into adult sexuality. And generally speaking, love is more altruistic here. There's less concern with self-pleasure in the earlier stages, if you have navigated the earlier stages correctly. Now, he would say that the choice of your partner is probably influenced by attitudes and social patterns established earlier. You might want to marry your mother, as you have probably heard people say before. So overall, there is some conflict, but it's a relatively calm time for almost all people, at least by the end of this stage. And that's his stage theory. That's it. So let's talk about the developmental issues. Remember, we said that we're going to talk about these for each theory. So human nature. He said that humans are conflicted, which is different than Piaget. Piaget thought people were relatively rational. But while Freud would say people are largely conflicted, he would also say that people are organismic. Meaning, again, like Piaget, the world is modeled based on living systems like plants and animals rather than machines. They are motivated by desires. They're motivated by what they want intrinsically, and by the desires, the physiological desires they have, as opposed to behaviorists saying that it's because of rewards and punishments from the outside world. Now, also, he said that they are motivated by desires, and Piaget said they are motivated by inherently interesting activities. They like doing what they're doing. Different. Okay, is it qualitative or quantitative? It is largely qualitative. There are stages here, but there are also qualitative stages in defense mechanisms and other aspects. So it's really primarily qualitative. You could say there's a little bit of quantitative in terms of the amount of, the relative amount in levels of preconscious, conscious, etc., but kind of minor. Is it nature or nurture? He's an interactionist also. You might not think this, but he said that there's a biological need that must be fulfilled by the individual. So there's the need, the nature part that results from biology, and there's the nurture, which is having that occur. And then finally on here, what develops? The structures. Id, ego, superego. Those are largely what are developing. And they channel and transform sexual energy. And let's get to the evaluation here. So strengths. There are some strengths. Developmental stages, psychological structures, unconscious motivation, and the importance of early experience all came from Freud. Think about that. Developmental stages. We had a lot of developmental stages, stage theories. Psychological structures, unconscious motivation, importance of early experience. These were all originated by Freud. So while he's not a proper developmental psychologist, he made huge contributions to developmental psychology. And he also caused a lot more research in morality, in sex and gender roles, identification, parent-child relationships, attachment, self-regulation, aggression. He was truly a pioneer. And so while many of his ideas were, in my mind, perverse, strange, if you want to be a little less harsh, he really delved into the human mind in a way that people just had not done previously, and led us down a road, even though he was wrong on almost everything. And then the second strength is that there's this non-logical thought, that people are very focused on rational problem solving. We really like doing that. Behaviorists really liked it. Even Piaget did. However, children become increasingly more adult-like over time, and how they do that, sometimes it's not completely rational. So looking at non-logical thought was important. Now, weaknesses. We could go on for a long time here, but let's just get it down to 3 things. The first thing is testability. And this is a big problem for people like me who are methodologically inclined. There's no way to do it. In many ways, his theory is beyond the scope of science. If you plopped him down today, he'd be a philosopher. He would not be, barring changes due to changes in the time, he really would not be a psychologist. Remember, he's a medical doctor, for God's sake. He would not be there at all. So his methodology and free association, dream analysis, transference, all of these things had major problems. So among the methodological problems, the way that psychoanalysis was done to him required that people were trained in psychoanalysis, which takes huge periods of time. And that meant that not a whole lot of people could do it. And that the only people who were doing it were people who really believed in it. So there's a bias going into that. And beyond that, there's experimenter error. He would record observations with clients hours after the sessions ended. So he could have picked and chose what fit in his theory and dumped the rest of it. And then testability with adult memories. We know that memory is really bad. Your memory of what happened yesterday is shockingly bad. So memories of people, and when I say your memory, my memory too. My memory is probably worse. Anyway, so when we think that adult memories can be accurate, that's probably not true. Now, I will say that what he would say, and I would agree with, is that what matters is not what actually happens, it's what people think happened, which I can buy into that. Sexuality. Many people didn't like this. However, Freud conveniently would say that if you don't like it, then you are repressing your own sexual memories from childhood. So currently there's zero evidence for this. However, you could reject this and still think that parts of his theory were okay. And actually, Erikson, we're going to see someone who did this largely. And then finally, bias. He mainly studied upper-class Puritan Austrians, and he was also primarily concerned about male development. And then the last part of bias, in my mind, is that when you go to someone who's a psychoanalyst, if you're not making progress, in their mind, it is because of you. Your defense mechanisms are up. And that's actually a really good business model, because you can basically say, if you're not getting better, it's your fault. You need to keep talking to me. But it just, obviously is not ideal. So Freud. So while the parts of Freud, the details of it are, relatively important, the bigger thing that I want you to take from it is not the facts, but more the understanding of how he could have influenced our current day in so many different ways. And that's something that maybe we'll talk about a little bit, discussion point.